Thank you. My camera is doing weird stuff. It's not never done before, but we'll try it anyhow. It was my pleasure to meet Joel Rhodes, the new director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, at a meeting of that group at a presentation a couple weeks ago, and thought that he would make a good presenter here. He has an interesting presentation. Joel joined the State Historical Society of Missouri as the executive director in 2025. He's also professor emeritus at Southeast Missouri State, where he taught history for 24 years and served as associate dean. Dr. Rhodes earned his PhD and MA from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and he has written 7 books, including Growing Up in a Land Called Honolulu, The 60s and the Lives of American Children, and A Missouri Railroad Pioneer, The Life of Lewis Houck, published by the University of Missouri Press. Joel?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's good to be able to talk about one of my specialties. I have been focused almost exclusively on Missouri history since I got here, but to be able to talk about my work with children and childhood in the Cold War period. I wrote a couple of books, the Honolulu book, and then there's a companion piece that explores specifically the impact of the Vietnam War on American childhood. And I guess I should probably give you a little background on how I came to this. I am a social and cultural historian of Cold War America, more specifically the Vietnam era. And I came by that naturally. I was born in the 60s. I'm Gen X at the very wake of the baby boom, born just a couple of years after the boom ended, to boomer parents who when the Vietnam War began, were graduating from high school, and my formative years really were surrounded by my dad going to Vietnam in 1970 and my mom drifting in and out of the anti-war movement and the counterculture. And so I really spent much of my professional career as a historian trying to make sense of not only the Vietnam era and the war itself, but its impact on my generation. When my dad came home from Vietnam, he was changed and not for the better, and left, and I didn't see him again for another almost 30 years. And I was amazed when I got much older that Lyndon Johnson was such a towering figure in my childhood that I couldn't believe when I started to study history that his name wasn't that goddamn Lyndon Johnson, because that's all I had ever heard him called in my household. And I came to understand LBJ as an incredibly complex and um, again a colossus over the Vietnam era. And I originally in grad school thought that I would become a LBJ historian, but social and cultural history became kind of my in. I had an advisor in grad school at UMKC. Her specialty was children and childhood, and she tried to get me to follow suit, but I didn't, and I came by that much later. I was really influenced by a book by Bill Tuttle called Daddy's Gone to War, which is, he explored the experience of the Second World War on pre-adolescent children. You know, there are hundreds of books written about the Second World War, but at the time when he wrote that book, there was nothing that really focused on children, and that those were one of those few texts in grad school that blew my hair back, and I wanted to duplicate Tuttle's work really on another very important era in American history, and that was the Vietnam era. So that's where the Honolulu book came from, and the methodology was based primarily on oral histories and interviews. This was when I started when I started the book, there were still a lot of smaller newspapers. So I wrote a letter to the editor to the 5 largest newspapers in each state, and I asked them to publish it and solicit stories from children that were pre-adolescents between the time Kennedy was inaugurated and Nixon resigned, so from 61 to 74. And I've received hundreds of responses from all over the country. And it took me years, really. It took me 2 or 3 years to sort through them and to put them into some type of usable form. I also then traveled to all the pertinent presidential libraries, except for Nixon. Most of the materials I needed at Nixon are still, they haven't been processed yet. There was some unpleasantness in the 70s. and most of Nixon's papers were going to be used as evidence in trials, and so that's the one presidential library that is generations behind processing those materials. But I looked at letters at the Gerald Ford Library that children wrote to the president about Watergate. And likewise, I looked at JFK and LBJ, those libraries, and looked at letters that children had written those two presidents. The book, Growing Up in a Land Called Honolulu, is clearly a reference to Puff the Magic Dragon, which was a lullaby for me as a kid. My mom would sing it to me every night. And then, so I always thought that was a logical title. And the introduction of the book is kind of built around the lyrics of that song. But I needed permission from Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary, to use that. And I quoted liberally from the song. It took me a while to get a hold of him, but eventually I did track him down through his agent. He's since passed on, but at the time when I finally got a call from him, I was beside myself. I mean, Peter, Paul, and Mary are those are big parts of my childhood. And so Peter Yarrow said, you know, I won't grant you permission until I've seen the manuscript. If you send me the manuscript, I'll take a look at it. And so I did. And a couple of months later, he got back and he said, "Hey, I love the book, and yeah, definitely will grant permission." My writing partner, Lenny Lipton, who was his roommate in college, co-wrote Puff. And he said, "I've got to get Lenny's permission as well," which he did. But he said, I got one stipulation. I want an autographed copy of the book." And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll do you one better. I'll send you an autographed copy, but I'm going to send you two, and you sign one and send it back to me." And he did. And the inscription is "Love from Puff's Daddy, Peter Yarrow." So that was, and I'm glad to be around folks that get that cultural reference, because when I would talk about this book when it first came out, I would mention that, and college students were like, they had no idea who Puff the Magic Dragon was, or Peter, Paul, and Mary. So really, the thrust of the book, and both of the books, Honolulu and Vietnam and American Childhood, look at how pre-adolescent children, younger than 12 years old, experienced all of the various social and political changes in the Vietnam era in the 60s, starting with John Kennedy, and the assassination, ultimately the space race, the arms race, the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and feminism. I always assumed that I would conclude the book with Watergate, but as I said, that wasn't possible. And what I found is that my generation, Gen X, shares a lot in common with the baby boomers, but there were some very significant differences. And on the outside, it's we were in the wake of that, and so we missed all of the very exciting, the sound and the fury of the '60s, if you will. We kind of came late to the party, and by the time we got there and we were all fired up to contribute, the country had moved on into the '70s and the malaise of the '70s, the post-Watergate, post-Vietnam oil crisis, and stagflation. And so we were never able to really participate in any meaningful way in what adults would understand as the '60s. But nonetheless, what I argue is the '60s are instrumental in our political and cultural socialization. It's fundamental to who we are. But like I said, there's a big difference in a lot of ways between us and the boomers, and in some ways a lot of similarities. We are the last generations raised by stay-at-home mothers who didn't work by and large. We grew up in a largely suburban-oriented world compared to later generations. There is a feralness to us. We're very independent. There's a do-it-yourself ingenuity to how we played and childhood. Again, in the '50s and '60s, toys were still relatively rare. Something that came, or I shouldn't say rare, but were relatively sparse. Toys were only gifted really for holidays. Today, kids get toys every other day, and they have a lot of them. And I think that's one of the reasons why Cold War era childhood toys are so timeless, and we have such a nostalgic feel for Barbie and for G.I. Joe and for the board games and so forth, because they were fairly precious to us. We were both raised with Dr. Spock's influence, that more permissive. My apologies to Dr. Spock. He did not like that term permissive, but a very child-centered approach to parenting where children are to be understood and not managed. That was still the owner's manual for parents when I was a kid in the 60s, as it was for kids who, well, for my mom and my dad's generation who were born immediately after the Second World War. But that's where the differences start to creep in. The early baby boom kids were raised in a nation that had a, fundamentally a consensus. There was a broad agreement on fundamental principles and values and politics. And the kind of the best way that I've always described it is in the early Cold War years in the 50s, there had never been so much promise in the country, flush from victory of the Second World War. The economy in the 1950s is the greatest in modern times by virtually every measure, regardless of what you hear today. The 1950s are really the hallmark for the American economy. There had never been so much, no, never been so much promise and no more optimism, but yet never had there been so much fear in the country. The Soviet Union posed a very formidable threat to our existence. And so it's that promise, that optimism that mixes so uneasily with the fear that essentially establishes the parameters for life in the 1950s. Virtually every facet of life, and that includes child rearing. There was security in having a large family, 2.6 children. There was security in a suburban house. There was security in, for a man in particular, having a job that was really risk aversive, but just a good, steady paycheck that could support a middle class lifestyle. And so for the children of the baby boom, they lived in an era where there were black and white truths. I mean, they were black and white. They were two-dimensional, but there were truths nonetheless. And so their upbringing in the 1950s established a certain mindset. And the baby boom is, demographically, probably to me as a 20th century American historian, one of the most important elements of modern America, and 76 million children. And one of the things that's particularly unique about that is that we're the only country that experienced such a thing after the Second World War. There was a bit of a bump in some of the countries, but Americans were the only one that procreated at the rate that we did. And demographers kind of assumed that it would dissipate in a few years, but it didn't. It only accelerated. The peak is 1957, and at one point, children were being born every 9 minutes. The rate of our population growth eclipsed India in the middle part of the 1950s, and that was really one of the things that got me interested in studying children and childhood in the Cold War. I ran across a statistic once that really blew my mind. 4 out of every 10 Americans were under the age of 20 in 1964, and there were more children under the age of 12 in 1964 than there had been people in the country in the 1880s. So this was a huge section that had never ever really been ever been studied. And so, as I said before, I started to look for entry points of how politics and culture and society impacted these pre-adolescent kids. And it's a trick to do that. Kids don't leave a paper trail the way a president does. I found it fascinating, though, to read children's letters to Kennedy and Johnson in particular. It's almost as if the kids understood instinctively that Kennedy was inspirational, and the letters that they wrote responded to the inspiration of Kennedy. Oftentimes asked how John and Caroline were doing. The President's Council on Physical Fitness was foremost in their mind. That was a way that they could contribute some sweat equity in this battle against the Soviets. I don't know if you remember the President's Council on Physical Fitness Award and the song Chicken Fat that accompanied that. A lot of kids were disgruntled that they had to do push-ups and pull-ups and climb a rope in gym class, but many were eager to do that. Johnson, they seemed to understand instinctively, was this big daddy that was very magnanimous with gifts. And so children rarely asked John Kennedy, for instance, for anything. But for Johnson, they oftentimes did, and wanted a new bike, wanted a new toy of some kind, wanted LBJ to arbitrate disputes. My favorite is there was a young lady, she was 12, just about to be 13. And she pointed that out that she was almost going to be a teenager, but the Beatles were coming to town and her parents would not let her go. And her friends were very upset about that. And she asked President Johnson if he would perhaps intervene on their behalf and talk their parents into allowing them to go see the Beatles. And there's no record that LBJ ever did, but yeah. So I knew a lot of the background in the community of Vietnam veterans, but then I explored the children of POWs and people that were MIA. I explored how children grew up in the counterculture, and that's a really fascinating chapter in the Hanalei book because if your parents were rejecting society in all its various manifestations and were thumbing their nose at authority in all the forms that it took, what do you do to rebel against your parents? I mean, when your parents are cultural rebels, there's not a whole lot you can do. And so you had to find other ways to drive your parents crazy. And oftentimes that was cutting your hair short and voting Republican, much to your parents' dismay. So, that was fascinating as well. The chapter on the civil rights movement was very inspirational and very moving. We think about young people in the civil rights movement. There were children as well, and we think specifically about in Birmingham and the Children's March, which was almost miraculous, but not quite spontaneous. But anyway, yeah, pre-adolescent children who actually put their lives and their bodies on the line for the cause of the Black civil rights struggle. Along the way, I became, I don't know, an expert, probably too strong of a word. I'm an enthusiast. I'm a connoisseur of toys from the Cold War era. And so my old office at Southeast looked like a sad old toy store that had gone out of business. And I had to remind people that actually this is my job. So I have all these toys in here. My favorite was an LBJ action figure, which only came out for a couple of years, but there is an LBJ doll. And there was a John F. Kennedy Halloween costume that was discontinued after Halloween in 1963. But yeah, those things exist, and they were all in my office, which made for an interesting atmosphere. But as I explored all these various ways that the 60s impacted children, some of the things you can imagine would be true. Some things were surprising. I'll give you an example. G.I. Joe, which was to young boys in the Cold War era the equivalent of Barbie, and actually I think was probably a much more appropriate mate for Barbie than Ken was. But G.I. Joe, when he came out in the early 1960s, was a soldier. He was an everyman soldier, probably from World War II, maybe from Korea, that you could pose yourself and you could be this one soldier. And that's significant because up until that time, war play was about commanding armies. Think about the little green army men that, you commanded entire battles and you were in charge of that. G.I. Joe was different. You were this one particular soldier, this G.I. Joe, and wildly popular in the early 1960s. Not quite eclipsing Barbie, but for a time, by far and away, Hasbro's most lucrative toy until Vietnam happened. And then after 1966, the popularity of G.I. Joe tanked. And so, because of the war, because of the contested nature of the war, he was redesigned. He was shrunk down from his original 12 inches to just a few inches, and he ceased to be a soldier. By the early 1970s, G.I. Joe was an adventurer. He went on safaris. He explored the jungle. He went deep sea diving. There's no hint of a uniform anymore. Although people will point out that the logo that Hasbro used for G.I. Joe in the early 1970s looked surprisingly like a peace sign. But anyway, to me, that was one of the more spectacular ways that, as you study children in childhood, you have to look at how culture manifests itself in their world. Parents had a really hard time buying a toy that conjured up the same images that they were seeing nightly, with Walter Cronkite narrating that day's body count and so forth. And so G.I. Joe, as a soldier, is really a casualty of Vietnam. Ultimately, what I found out about kids my generation, Gen X, that were born after 1964 in the wake of the baby boom, is that unlike the baby boomers, again, who have very concrete ideas about America, about American leadership, about America's role in the world, that mirrors in many ways their parents, the greatest generation from the Second World War, a very concrete, again, very bedrock faith in the American dream, in American political systems, the infallibility of American political leadership, faith and support in especially the presidency. Those things are earmarks of the baby boom. Now, when the baby boomers got a little older in the 60s and were in college, they started to question that. But many of them fell back on, eventually later on in their life course, fell back on the things that they had learned in their childhood, the inherent goodness of the United States as a population of decent, honorable people. My generation really being reared in a time of contested culture when so much was up for grabs in the United States. Again, America's role in the world, questions of, social justice and racism and discrimination, a conflict between war and peace, and the most powerful nation in human history destroying a small third world developing nation. And then, of course, Watergate calling into question, really for the very first time, our faith just in the inherent goodness of the presidency. If you look at Gallup polls in the Cold War era, the vast majority of the American people, if they didn't support politically the sitting president, they had an almost religious-like reverence for the office of the presidency. And the 60s broke that down, the Vietnam era. And so my generation was raised, they were seeped in a polarization. And so our default setting is polarization. Our default setting is cynicism. And I think probably the real hallmark of the latter Cold War kids is their very diminished expectations for government, their very diminished expectations of the presidency, and America's role in the world, America's moral authority in the world. And I think I'm a serviceable historian. I'm a terrible futurist. But I think you can see some of the downstream consequences of being raised as a pre-adolescent in the Vietnam era, when the country had not been as divided as we had since the 1860s. And we carry that division with us. So, yeah, that's me yammering a little bit. How about some questions? I'll talk a little bit about the State Historical Society too at some point if you'd like.
Well, I have one quick technical question.
Sure.
Which of those GI Joe logos do you reminds me of the piece? There's one that's Cobra, kind of separated, and there's another with Eagle and Star.
No, it's before that. It's the 70s era. It's the action team. So it's a
Action
circle with
team.
an A in the middle that
Circle
looks
with A.
almost, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that looks a little bit like an inverted peace sign.
Okay. I'm gonna look for that. That's
Mhm.
interesting.
You know,
Or
another
or
thing
s-
that
yeah.
comes up in regard to Vietnam, the POW MI bracelets. I did a lot of work looking into the phenomenon of those bracelets from the Vietnam era, and I have worn the same one, not the exact same bracelet. This is the fifth iteration of that, but I've worn the same name since 1974. He was an MIA. He was killed in 1965, and his remains were eventually recovered. And I've just never had the heart to take it off. They eventually wear thin, or I'll lose them water skiing or something. But I've worn that same bracelet. And what I didn't comprehend or really think about is that those bracelets and the millions that were sold, each POW, there were only several hundred POWs and MIAs. Throw the MIAs and then you got over 1,000, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, of each man's name out in circulation. And so we thought, of course, that the name we had, we were the only person in the country that had that name, but actually there were hundreds. And these are called bracelet families. And many people eventually either returned their bracelet to the returned POW, or they reached out to each other and found each other, especially in the era of the internet. And so many POWs, when they came home, they had heard about the bracelets. Word had gotten into North Vietnam through the Red Cross and through some of those conduits of information that people were wearing these bracelets. Marlon Brando had them, Sonny and Cher had them on their show, and so forth. But they were really overwhelmed when they got home that they started to receive hundreds of these bracelets in the mail. It's hard to keep up with all of that.
Herb or Sue.
Yeah. Any other
Thank,
questions?
thank,
Yes, I'm
yes, good to see you again. Thank you again for taking the post of director. We appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your comments later about the future of this society.
Oh,
But I
sure.
want to pick up on the very interesting line you're following here of the Cold War generation, which I have long looked at as generations, plural, in combination with in conversations long ago in the 1960s with graduate school mate, same university, same department, Doris Kearns Goodwin,
Sure.
whom you know.
Mhm.
I'm not a historian, by the way. We're both political scientists, and she won't admit it. Anyway, one of the things that we felt in conversation with each other was there was a very interesting divide within the Cold War generations between those who were born in the baby boom and
Mhm.
later,
Sure.
you
Mhm.
and later, and those who were born 10 years earlier, between 5 and 10 years earlier,
Sure.
late 30s and 40s, many of whom became part of the 1960s protest movement,
Mhm.
including Daniel Ellsberg, Morton Halperin, Leslie Gelb. But we all, before we did that, were first McNamara whiz kids.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Exactly.
And I was wondering if this is consistent with your book, which I've never had the pleasure of reading.
No, yeah, very, very, very consistent. And the socialization that the early baby boomers faced, um, in the early 1960s, we as a generation never really experienced that. The water had been churned up so much, especially by the activism, that we didn't. I think there's a lot of social imitation for my side of the baby boom generation, whereas opposed to I think those people that you mentioned were all true believers in some regard, and it's challenging for a pre-adolescent. And I mix in a lot of child psychology, developmental psychology in my analysis because it matters. Historical forces matter, but they matter more importantly when they're experienced in your developmental, your years, whether it's psychological or educational. And it was really upsetting to children of my generation. And again, my parents were both boomers. They graduated in 1965 from high school, and it was upsetting to see them so out of sorts. Pre-adolescent children, they want to see their parents be certain of something, even if it's the wrong thing. They want to see their parents certain of this. And for baby boomers that, the true boom that were born immediately after the Second World War and throughout the 1950s, again, there were standards and there were values that dated back to the Great Depression. And rebelling against those is a big part of the 60s experience. But for my generation, there weren't concrete values. Culture and politics were being contested, and to see parents agonize and question and challenge, that was upsetting to children. Children like to know that mom and dad have got this, that mom and dad know exactly what they're doing, and mom and dad are in control. And in the 60s, that just wasn't the case. Yes.
Okay, I have an interesting background in the sense I was born in 42, but my father had been Canadian and my mother grew up in China as a missionary's child.
Hmm.
And my parents worked at two of the Japanese prison camps
Oh,
during
okay.
World War II. So my
Hmm.
background for my age bracket was very different. In fact, when I wrote a paper in high school about the Japanese American uh, camps, my dad still had a few notes. My mother was deceased. My mother worked as a social worker, my dad as a relocation officer. None of my classmates in Franklin, Indiana, 30 miles of Indianapolis, had never heard the Japanese
Oh,
Americans had put in camp.
like,
But, and so my background, I never fit in totally because, and my parents were also not racist. My father, I'm fairly sure he may have, because he was a University of Chicago student, graduate student, as was my mother in social work. I think my dad might have, even from something he said, I think he may have even visited a commune cell because he
sure.
said the Moonies had nothing on them. And this is after we had heard Arlo Guthrie give a speech after he got a PhD, honorary doctorate from Rocky Mountain College in Billings, Montana.
Hmm.
But anyway, so I didn't fit in.
Right,
So some of what you're talking is not, but I had a very ethical background. So it's
right,
very
yeah,
interesting that how different it made some of my thoughts be.
right. In the years of McCarthyism, you're what's generally referred to as a red diaper baby. You were born with leftist parents. Yeah. So, yeah. Yep, exactly. And there are a lot of people that came up in the anti-war movement, in the movement itself, that had a similar background, that were raised to question the consensus view of American history, where American history was just a continual march forward, and we don't really play up all the ugliness and the messiness of it, which was kind of the standard in the 1950s. There had never been a greater threat to the nation, so this wasn't the time to rock the boat and criticize American history or the presidency. It's time to come in with the home team for the big victory. So, yeah, that was,
And I
yep.
will also tell a story on my husband. We weren't married at this point, and there was this speech, what do you call it? The speech in at Harvard.
Oh, it's
I had
teach-in.
to teach in. I had
Right.
to go in through a third floor window to get into it. Herb would not go to speeches with me. So he was staid and more conservative than me. But I also want to thank the society. I got interviewed last week
Oh, okay.
because I was interested in giving a little different viewpoint on the Merrimack Dam and Lester Dill.
Oh, okay. Okay. Very good. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, my parents are an interesting case study, and they're slow to admit this, but it makes perfect sense. My parents graduated from high school in 1965, so they got married in the fall of 1964 during their senior year in high school, and that was always very curious to me because I wasn't born until 3 years later. I wasn't born until 67, so it wasn't that they had to get married. But then when I began to research this book,
So you wouldn't
Some
have to go
things
into
fell into
Vietnam.
place. Yeah, and when the draft first began, the draft call-ups, a
Yes.
marriage deferment was still a valid way to stay out of service and not be channeled into military service. And so I thought, well, that's interesting, and because after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, they were married just a couple of weeks after the Gulf of Tonkin in so I thought, well, that is strange. And then in 1966, when the country was having a hard time keeping up with the draft quotas, Selective Service changed that, and a marriage deferment was no longer enough. You had to have a dependent child. And so my mom got pregnant in mid 1966. So I am a draft avoidance strategy, and ultimately it didn't work because dad wound up in Vietnam anyway.
Hmm.
Al.
Yeah, I actually had a couple questions. One is where do you draw the line between baby boom and Gen X? What is the birth year for Gen X?
Generally, it's murky, but generally 64 is considered the last year of the boom and the first year of Gen X.
Because it
Now,
seems like the kids that were born, you know, 3 or 4 years before that, probably more like Gen X than like the early boomers at least.
right, right. As far as demographics, oftentimes you probably heard the baby boom referred to as the pig and the python because the generation before and after are much smaller. My generation is smaller than the baby boomers, and the greatest generation was smaller. The smallest birth cohort in modern America is during the Great Depression. Americans just aren't having very many children. So the baby boom is unique in that they are bookended by these much smaller generations. And 1964 is when the boom, just demographically in terms of sheer numbers, really tapers off. But what changes to me is not the number of us, it is the parenting style. The early boomers were raised in a very child-centered, child-oriented household. Those 2.6 baby boom children for every family were the center of their parents' universe. And much of that has to do with the Cold War. I mean, there's strength in a strong nuclear family. And you got to figure for the greatest generation, having grown up in the Great Depression and then the Second World War, what they wanted was stability. And what they wanted was security. And then, of course, in the 1960s, people said we can, being secure is not being free. It's not living a fulfilling life. But for the early baby boomers, they were reared to be the center of their parents' universe. And I always use for students in particular the sitcoms of the 50s. Leave It to Beaver is probably the most spectacular example of that. But if you think about the characters in Leave It to Beaver, and again, it's not a perfect metaphor, but it's pretty close. I mean, Ward is a perfect example of the organization man. It's never really stated what he does, but he's an accountant actually for Lumpy's dad. He works with Lumpy's dad. But anyway, yeah, he never brings the office home with him. Work is not something that you ever see on Leave It to Beaver. The family is what's important. It's being dad. That's how Ward derives his identity. June is the perfect Cold War era early baby boom mother. She is a homemaker. She does not aspire to work outside of the home. She keeps that house running so efficiently. She is the master of that domain. She keeps the house spotless. She looks really good when Ward comes home. She keeps a pretty tight lid or a tightish lid on Wally and the beaver. But if you ever notice with Leave It to Beaver, whenever June ventures from the house, spatially, the further away from that house she gets, the more incompetent she becomes. And the message is very clear that women's roles are in the home. Hey, Rosie the Riveter, we thank you for your service, but now's the time to go back to child rearing as your primary vocation, and you should achieve complete fulfillment as a woman from raising your kids and keeping the house clean and so forth. But again, the stars of the show are Wally and the Beaver. I mean, their antics drive the storyline. So again, the message is pretty clear that parenting is what real Americans do. There is a very polarized, very Victorian like a suburban version of Victorianism when it comes to gender roles. And if you think about it, a couple of points. Not only does June become more incompetent as she gets away from the home, there's only one woman on 1950s television who breaks that mold, and it's Lucy. And every time Lucy tries to have an occupation, it's an abject disaster. It blows up in her face. Again, the message is very, very strong. Home is where women should be. And if you think about it, when Ward does something that blurs those gender lines, like cook, for instance, I mean, he goes when he wants to cook something, he can't do it in the kitchen because that's feminine space. He goes outside. He cooks outside like a pioneer, like a caveman. And that's okay. If a guy cooks, it's got to be meat and it's got to be outside in the great outdoors. You can't bake a cake in the kitchen. So, yeah, those traditional barriers were breaking down for my generation. For instance, because of the rising divorce rate in the early 1970s, primarily because of Vietnam. Um, Many of us, not the majority, but a very sizable minority, were reared, at least for a period, in single parent households. And in the Vietnam era, a single parent household, by definition, is a mother headed household. And so we were reared in a family that wasn't nuclear in the early Cold War sense, but was female headed. And keep in mind that for my mother, who graduated in '65, I came in around a couple of years later, and when my dad didn't really come back from Vietnam, mom was amongst the first women who had to open a checking account, had to register a car, something she couldn't do when she was married. So that made for a different dynamic in our generation. We got to see strong women making decisions and being the head of the household, and that was much different than the early baby boom.
I was thinking about Leave It to Beaver actually, and while they missed a lot of stuff that we know now about racism, sexism, what they did have was a consistent message of uh, treat people well, be
Mhm.
honest, and I don't know if and I doubt there's that model at all today in mass media and TV. But
Right.
but was that still there in your generation when you were growing
Yeah,
up?
yeah, a little bit. Things, and one of the biggest changes, like I said, is not just that that the rate of population growth shrinks, that the birth rate shrinks and the divorce rate skyrockets when I was a child. It's that the very nature of parenting began to change, and this is because of the '60s. This is because of the Vietnam era. Like I said, in the 1950s, the Leave It to Beaver years is a very child-centered feel to childhood, and Spock plays a role in this as well. Get to know the children, don't give them the beating they so richly deserve. Nurture them and allow them to make their own mistakes and express their own opinions, like Wally and the Beaver. Let them have their own adventures and so forth. By the time I was a kid in the late '60s and early 1970s, and again, this is a downstream result of the changes in the '60s, childhood and parenting had really evolved from child-centered to more adult-centered. They don't call the '70s the me decade for nothing. It was a very adult-oriented time. And so children as the center of the family, that had diminished by the time I was a kid, and that's why my generation generally prides itself on being feral. I mean, we were turned out of the house early in the morning. We, would drive around the neighborhood on our bikes and look for our friends. We, create pickup games of football or baseball or wiffle ball or whatever we could find to hit. We drank from the garden hose, and we didn't come home until the streetlights came home. Whereas Wally and the Beaver, the early baby boom generation, they were raised by a very doting mom and a very doting dad. Gen X, those born after 1964, were largely raised on parental neglect and water out of hose water.
Water out of the hose. I love that.
Yeah.
Um, I want to talk to you about Melvin Leffler and why the Cold War was a total mistake, which I discovered
Sure.
once I got to Moscow. But
Sure.
actually, I think that would be too big of a discussion.
That'll be
I think,
another time. Yeah.
yeah, I think we want to hear a little bit more about your goals as director of Missouri Historical Society and what we should know about what's going on. There are a lot of locations of it. I think people don't know.
Sure. Yeah.
There are a lot of things. I'm I've been to the Missouri Conference on History, but that's about all I know as
Oh,
as
very
a
good. Very
European
good.
historian.
Mhm.
I don't know your rich things, but you're a public historian, you're a cultural
Mhm.
historian.
Mhm.
You probably have a pitch for us that
Sure.
could be useful in making use of your fine organization.
Sure, excellent. I appreciate that opportunity. So, when Senator Blunt, who was the president of our board of trustees, when he hired me last year, I was preparing for retirement at Southeast Missouri State. But when he offered me the job, he said, "You will be the sixth director
Yeah,
since the society was formed in 1898."
yeah.
He said, "This seems to be a really hard job to get." And then he grinned and said, "And apparently a really hard job to lose." So, but by my calculations, I joke about this. I'm gonna have to work into my 90s to keep the average up. So the State Historical Society, our mission is pretty clear. We collect, preserve, and share all things Missouri history and Missouri culture. And we've been doing it since 1898 when we were formed by the Missouri Press Association as an archive for their newspapers. So that's why. And the Missouri Press Association is just a couple blocks down from the Historical Society. And so those newspapers still are the backbone of our collection. We have the largest collection of state newspapers in the nation, and we continue to collect those every day. But the way I always explain what we do, being a historian, as you know, it's pretty easy. Know enough to speak intelligently about virtually anything, but more importantly, know where to look up the details. So we're where you look up the details. We don't have an archive, or pardon me, we don't have a museum. We don't collect three-dimensional things. We are primarily a research library, an archive, and an art gallery. And we have between the Columbia office, the headquarters, and our branch offices is in Columbia, the Center for Missouri Studies, that big, beautiful new building. But we also have five other research centers around the state on the campus of UMKC, on the campus of UMSL in St. Louis, Missouri State in Springfield, at Missouri S&T in Rolla, and at Southeast Missouri State in Cape Girardeau. Those are only satellite facilities. They're each staffed by one or two, maybe three people. And we do have collections there, but they're entry points. So if somebody, let's say in Rolla, wants to do research in the Claire McCaskill papers, which we have in Columbia, they can go to our Rolla Center and we can courier those down to them. We can deliver those papers. Claire's a bad example actually because she's the only congressional collection we have that is born digital. There's nothing paper about Claire's collection at all. So we have right in the neighborhood of about 1 million different items in our collection, and we're trustees of the state since 1899, our second year of existence. We became trustees of the state, so everything we hold is as a trustee for the people of Missouri. And because of that, we are funded through the legislature. We get an appropriation every year through higher education. And that makes up about 80% of our funding. The other 20% that we get is from our membership and our donors and grants. The 80% that we get from the state, that covers our salaries. When we have 52 full-time and part-time employees, and then we have a whole army of volunteers that we literally could not function without. So the state covers our salaries. All of our programming, that's funded through our membership and through donations. So that we are constantly in a process of trying to feed the beast. And the way we share that information. We have our lecture series, History on Elm. We have a companion series, Music on Elm, which is new, that we're really proud of. We host the Missouri Conference on History. We have an African American Experience lecture series a couple of times a year. We host the our annual meeting in the fall, and we also sponsor National History Day in the state. Yeah, so that's we are the state sponsor for that. We, in regard to publishing, we have been publishing the Missouri Historical Review since 1906. That's the only scholarly journal about Missouri history in the country. So we are committed to academic publishing. We do publish books periodically. It's rare, but we do publish books. We have the Missouri Encyclopedia, which is online. We have a children's version of that called Historic Missourians that is likewise online. But like I said, all of that, all of our programming is funded through our membership and through our donors. As far as the our collection, said we have about 1 million things. Yeah, we do, and they're most all two-dimensional. We only have a couple, just a handful of three-dimensional things. That's why we don't have a museum. The Missouri State Museum collects the three-dimensional culture. We have Mark Twain's pipe for some reason, but that's one of the few three-dimensional. It still smells like it's not that. I mean, Twain at any one time was probably smoking a dozen different pipes, but half of that 1 million is in our research library, which is open to researchers all around the world, genealogists, historic preservationists, scholars. Genealogists make up a big bunch of our constituency. But in that reference library, we have the newspaper collection and throw out some impressive statistics. We have 72 million pages of newspapers on about 60,000 microfilm rolls. The rest of the library are genealogical studies, they're state papers. We were the state archives until 1965. And so we have all state documents up until 65. Warren Hearns is the last governor for whom we have his papers. And then the state archives was open in 65 and they took all that stuff. We have county records, we have municipal records, church records. We have cemetery indexes, probate records, lots of genealogical studies of various families. We have a sound archive, about 8,000 items in that. Music, that's one of our big collecting initiatives right now is the Como Music Project, trying to document the Columbia music scene in the Cold War era, in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, the birth of rock and roll and the rock and roll era. So we have that. The other 500,000 are the manuscripts, the archives that we have. Civil War diaries, World War One letters, World War II letters. Probably our most high profile are the congressional papers that we have. We have the congressional papers and other papers of Kit Bond, Roy Blunt, Claire McCaskill, Jack Danforth, Tom Eagleton, Dewey Short, Bill Emerson, who else? Bill Hungate, which is fascinating because Hungate was on the House Judiciary Committee that drew up articles of impeachment against Nixon. So that's an underutilized collection. I'd like to see people start to use that more. Jack Danforth was in the Center for Missouri Studies last fall, and we had an exhibit, his two-dimensional exhibit, but it was based on his papers. And I remember as I'm standing there looking at the exhibit with him, was looking specifically at the panel that deals with the Panama Canal. And he said, I have no idea what my obituary will read like, but I guarantee you that in the first sentence, there will be 4 words: Clarence Thomas and Panama Canal. But the reason I bring that up is in Danforth's papers, there are 2 file boxes that are sealed for another 30 years, and those are the files for the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing. Danforth was his sponsor, and those files are sealed. Even we can't open them. I'm really curious as I walk by, but there they sit, and will continue to sit long after I'm gone. But yeah, and we also have the art gallery, which is amazing. About 8,000 pieces in the art gallery. The the cornerstones of those are George Caleb Bingham and Thomas Hart Benton. But we have political cartoons from Fitzpatrick and Englehart. We have a lot of Missouri artists. And an interesting trivia question, that's how we got the building, really. If you remember back in the old days, for the vast majority of our existence, we were in the basement of Ellis Library. And the society had always wanted its own standalone building. And when Matt Blunt was governor, for insurance purposes, he asked that our art collection be appraised. It hadn't been appraised in many, many years. And so the appraisal came back just for the Binghams and the Bentons, just those two collections, came back at $100 million. And so Blunt said, you need a better building for that, that very valuable art collection. So that's essentially who we are. As far as my time here, my focus really is in two primary areas: working with local historical societies and re-energizing that relationship with them, using our resources to be able to amplify what they do and support them. So a lot of what I've been up to for the last year since I've been here is traveling to all corners of the state, meeting with local historical societies, genealogical societies, preservation groups, house museums, and so forth, and seeing how we can be of most use to them and developing the tools that we can use to help them fulfill their mission. That's our main constituency. And so I want to put a lot of emphasis on that. The other major priority that I have is with education. I think we have not maximized our potential to help teachers teach Missouri history. And by the time I'm done here in the next 10 years, probably, what I would like to see us be is not only the flagship for Missouri studies, but the flagship for teachers, creating curriculum, writing lesson plans, supplemental materials, professional development for Missouri teachers. And as long as the legislature is cooperative, and that's looking, the budget outlook in Missouri is pretty bearish for the next couple of years. I would really like to see us expand in the educational area. Again, the way I see the State Historical Society of Missouri, we are the flagship for Missouri studies, and we should be the place that historians of all flavors, whether or not you're amateur, an enthusiast, or an academic historian, we're the place where you come to look up the details.
There's one question on the chat from Kathy I'd like to ask. Have
Sure.
you been pressured by the current administration to eliminate materials that reflect badly on Missouri, such as lynching of Black people?
No, and people have posed that question to me before, and during the legislative session, I spent a lot of time in Jeff City, and making sure that our appropriation makes it through unscathed. But no, and I think we have had no pressure whatsoever thus far to revise history or to emphasize certain things and de-emphasize others. And I think what really shields us or insulates us to a great degree is we don't have a museum. We don't interpret history. And our mission is to collect, preserve, and share, whereas a museum, generally, their mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret history. And therein lies the difference. We're primarily just an archive. And so historians come, they use our raw materials, and they interpret. So we generally don't get much attention when it comes to revisionist history.
Herb, uh, get get your sound on.
Okay,
There you go.
thank you. Thank you. Two things.
Mm-hmm.
One is there's a person, I'm in Lenore in assisted living. A person on my floor has been donating to the State Historical Society.
Oh, okay.
30 boxes. And I'm thinking, how many individuals can you take that take 30 boxes?
We actively collect, but our resources are finite. If we stopped collecting tomorrow, and with our current staff, it would take us 12 years to process everything we currently have. So, but we are still actively collecting. I mean, that is
Well,
our job. That's our
well,
mission.
and
But
a number of them are photographs because he
oh,
took photographs of every new parishioner in his church.
oh
He's taken
wow.
pictures of every person that he sees and hears about in Lenore, whatever. I just couldn't believe that
Yeah.
you can't have all citizens of Missouri provide that much
No.
material.
Oh no, 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 most don't. But when we get a collection of that size in particular, it's really it's an incredibly valuable experience for us, and we take very seriously the role of protecting that and keeping it for people. Like I said, we haven't collected much in the way of Missouri politics since 1965, so virtually all the collections that we have acquired, in the last 50 years are from people, just common Missourians, photographers, clergy, women's groups, clubs, all of those various things. And as a social historian and cultural historian, that's the real stuff for me. I mean, all those historical forces are really important, but they're only important to the point where they impact people, where average Americans' lives, the fabric or the threads of their life intersects with these larger threads to create this tapestry.
Yeah. And the other one quick thing, this Route 66 exhibit
Mhm.
here was very informative for being as compact as it was, and
Oh,
having a lecture here was wonderful.
Oh,
Thank you.
fantastic. And just to give you a heads up, we will rotate those out, of course,
Good.
every year. So Route 66 is this year, and we have two companion traveling exhibits that will be going around the state that are based on that. Next year, we are going to have Germans in Missouri. That will be the exhibit. The year after that will be the Vietnam era in Missouri. And then after that, it will be agriculture. So we've got the exhibits planned out for the next few years. And they'll make
Get a woman's one in there next.
we
After
will definitely, yeah, definitely. We have our I think one of our most important collections is women in media. That there's a new exhibit. It's not installed in the center, but it will be virtual. So there's a women in media virtual exhibit that will open really just in the next couple of weeks. So check the website periodically for that new exhibit. It's magnificent, the work that they have done, but it's based on our really sizable women in media collection.
We passed the top of the hour, but our guest has agreed to stay a little longer. So I'll see what Alice has to ask.
Okay, so I recently, last year, joined the Historical Society. As a former history major, I of course respect your work, but I want to add to what the last speaker said, and I think you should have an exhibit on civil rights issues in Missouri. You could highlight Ferguson, and hopefully there's some people out there that have records of everything that happened there. We're fast erasing that kind of history in our country, and I'm sure that's true for Missouri.
Sure.
We're trying to at least.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you for telling me. I was thinking of Danforth as a moderate. So here's my question. Probably don't have an answer. Have you at all heard that Danforth has spoken with concern about clearance and the way he's been voting?
Yes, and I think
Great.
he's been pretty forthcoming about that. The genesis of that exhibit we did last year was Eagleton and Danforth, and it came about quite honestly. Our archivists that were processing both of those congressional collections, the Eagleton and Danforth papers, were really struck by the fact that they were good friends, but on opposite sides of the aisle. And especially for younger archivists on our staff that have been reared in the 21st century, that seemed almost impossible that these two men, one a Democrat and one a Republican, could maintain such a warm and genuine friendship. And so that's where the exhibit came from, and it was based on their personal relationship. On civil rights, yeah, definitely. There will be a component in the 1960s exhibit about not only the civil rights movement, kind of the traditional civil rights movement in St. Louis, but then also the riot in Kansas City in 1968. I did a
Great.
chapter in my first book on the 1968 riot, and so it's kind of the traditional King years civil rights component in St. Louis, but then also the Black Power element of that with the Kansas City riot. So yeah, we're leaning into that, but we don't have a standalone civil rights exhibit.
Okay, well, that sounds wonderful. And also, I want to applaud you for having music on some Fridays. I keep
Oh,
meaning
thank
to
you.
make it there, but there's so many great musicians in this town. Yeah, you are an incredible asset having you in Columbia instead of Jeff City. I wouldn't
Oh.
travel that far to go see your art exhibit or whatever, but it is a jewel. And I'm going to put my friend, have you worked at all with Como Preservation in Columbia? Are you
I
aware of
have.
it?
I am a member. Yeah, I am a member, and we went to the cakes and cocktails event a couple of weeks ago. But just starting to feel my way around in Columbia. My wife and I moved here last June, and we
Uh-huh.
love it. Absolutely are charmed, and we love it. So, yeah, I have a real affinity for the preservation community, and that's definitely one of my priorities. I will say I will make a plug for an event that we have coming up. We have several for the America 250 event, but my favorite, I think, on July the 8th, if you're still in the mood to celebrate, we are going to have a public reading of the Declaration of Independence, and
Uh-huh.
that's a nationwide event that coincides with the 250th anniversary of the first public reading of the Declaration in Philadelphia on July the 8th, 1776. But all across the nation, people will be simultaneously reading it beginning at 5 p.m. Central Time. And we have a lineup of folks. We have 10 readers that will read the Declaration. I'm going to read a little bit. Mayor Barbara is going to read. Linda Godwin, who is an astronaut, taught at Mizzou for years.
Right.
Colonel John Clark, who was a POW in Vietnam. We've got some kids. We've got a pretty good, I think, cross section of folks. And I got to say, I've been studying history my entire life, but when we first started working on this project, I did not honestly know how long it would take to read the Declaration of Independence out loud. Takes about 40 minutes, give or take. So check our website out. We've got a great musical act. Theron Denson, who was born and raised in Columbia. He now lives in Los Angeles. He is the Black Diamond. He is a African American Neil Diamond tribute artist. And there's got to be a
Oh,
story how that happened. He is the only Black Neil Diamond singer in the country, but he will be the musical act. We've got a couple of actors from the Arrow Rock Lyceum that are playing John and Abigail Adams. They're going to do a scene from that musical that they're doing up in Arrow Rock. And then we've got ice cream and refreshments. It should be a fun evening. So check that out, and I hope you can join us.
that sounds great. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, I'm going to have one last question, which I think is appropriate as the last one. Ruth is interested in your books, and she asks, are they available at the Historical Society store, or does she have to get online to find, to look up your name and your titles?
Growing Up in a Land Called Honolulu is in the bookstore because it was published by the University of Missouri Press. The Vietnam War and American Childhood book, we don't carry that because it was published by the University of Georgia Press.
Oh,
Uh,
no.
yeah, so my biography of Lewis Houck is there. Again, it was published by
Okay.
MU Press. I have a couple of books just on the 60s that you would have to get online, and I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I wrote a book of ghost stories called Haunted Cape Girardeau, where I used to live. And when the publisher first approached me to write that book, I used to do a radio show about ghosts. oddly enough. And they said, "Would you like to write this book? To kind of turn the radio show into a book?" And I turned it down. I said, I'm writing this other book, my day job, and I can't really spare the time. And my wife said, you know what? You ought to really rethink that because unlike your scholarly books, this one might actually sell. People might really read that.
It's
And
true.
she was right. It's in its ninth printing. I make literally tens of dollars on that book every year. And I say that only because it is in the bookstore. So you can get my Haunted Cape Girardeau book along with Hanalei. And let me know if you come in. I'll be happy to sign it for you.
That is wonderful, and I can vouch for how those little honoraria come in only to complicate your tax filings
That's
from time
exactly
to
right.
time.
That is, yeah. Yeah,
Costs
once
more to
you
file the taxes than you get from the books.
You're
But
exactly right. Yeah. Once you go down the royalties rabbit hole on
yeah,
the 1040, I know it. Can
Dr.
confirm.
Rhodes, Joel, it's been such a pleasure to meet you. We will recommend this presentation to everyone that we can to get to know you and encourage them to get involved. And I'll put your new education ideas or program ideas on my prayer list that it will be
Awesome.
able to
Thank
I will
you.
be able to develop and transform without too much interference
Excellent.
from certain quarters,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
and to serve the cause of education, which we value so much
Yeah.
in our
Thank you very
state
much.
and in our country. I want to thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much. And I hope to see you around the Center for Missouri Studies. And if you're there, come up and say hi to me, please. It's been an
Okay,
absolute pleasure. Thank you.
great. Well, folks, while Pam is loading up our announcements, I'll say that was